Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we're going to be going over Smelter's Wrath, Dual Chronostasis, Rebuke, Ward Stacking, Forge Guard. So, the concept behind this build is to utilize dual Chronostasises. Now, Chronostasis is a weapon that is kind of a meme, but it actually has some niche synergies with the current setup that I'm playing. And that is because Chronostasis gives you a really large amount of flat damage for your next melee attack, as long as you have some ward to consume. Now, this is flat damage is ridiculous. You can get well over like 400, 500, 600-ish flat damage on this build. You can get even more if the Chronostasis that I had rolled better, but it didn't, but that's fine. And of course, that leads to a lot of damage, but the problem is it only synergizes really well with skills that are slow to attack. Well, thankfully, we have access to Smelter's Wrath. Smelter's Wrath is a big melee attack that charges, and it does a really large hit. And that's kind of the whole concept of this build, is to utilize the dual Chronostasises, stack as much flat damage as possible throughout the tree, and with Chronostasises to hit with Smelter's Wrath as hard as possible. Now you must be wondering, Dread, how are we sustaining such large amounts of ward to consume with chronostasises? Well, that is because of Apostate Sanctuary. So essentially what this unique amulet does is it turns off our spells. Essentially, we can't really use any spells, as you can tell on my bar, and it means that we, of course, get 8 ward per second per physical resistance while channeling Rebuke. I have like almost 400-ish% physical resistance. It's like, I think it's higher than that. So we're getting like well over 3,200 ward per second while channeling Rebuke. Now, after the end of Rebuke, we usually end up at like 10k ward. Now, even with the 500% ward retention that I currently have, or I'm supposed to have, but we'll talk about that later, even with that amount of ward retention, at 10k ward, you're going to be losing it very quickly, as you can see in the footage. So, you know what you do with the top half of your ward? You sacrifice it for, of course, Chronostasis, which means that even after we use Chronostasis to attack with Smelter's Wrath, we end up with well over like 4k-ish, 5k-ish ward, which is a lot for a Forge Guard. That's like 6k EHP in total every single time we cast Rebuke and then cast Smelter's Wrath. And all of that combined means that not only are we benefiting a lot from just having a gigantic ward pool, thanks to, of course, Apostates, we also get to take advantage and skim a little off the top to make our Chronostasis, make our Smelter's Wrath do a lot of damage. Now, of course, Chronostasis has a few problems, like for instance, it has no base crit on it, but that's solved by having access to the auto crit inside Smelter's Wrath. You have gigantic AoE with Smelter's Wrath, which really turns up the efficiency of your ward, which is great. And overall, you end up just becoming really tanky because turns out Rebuke taking 80% less damage and you get 3,200 ward per second. You can face tank almost everything in the entire game, even T4 Drilla's explosions if you really wanted to. And that helps a lot because it makes up for the fact that we're sitting there and channeling half the time. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. This build is not very what I would call entertaining. It's very snooze festy because, you swap from channeling Rebuke to Smelter's Wrath to Rebuke to Smelter's Wrath. You spend a very large amount of time sitting still. And of course, if you're not into that, then that's completely understandable. But there are going to be some specific individuals who will absolutely enjoy this playstyle, specifically individuals who have bad RSI or individuals that just want to be able to watch Netflix while playing the game. All of that combined works really well for this build. If you really want to end up watching like the entirety of One Piece while you're waiting for your Rebuke to channel up, then you can. That's the absolute wonderful thing about Last Epoch, is there's a playstyle for everybody. So Rebuke overall, like I think it makes up for the fact that you have to stand still with Smelter's Wrath, right? Because we get a large amount of ward while channeling, a large amount of armor while channeling, and essentially we are trying to scale enough ward so that we can survive after we consume the ward with the chronostasis, right? Because that's the biggest problem, is if we're consuming half of our ward essentially every single time we want to do anything, that means that we need to have a ridiculous amount of ward. That means that Every single slot on our character has either physical resistance or cold resistance because we're utilizing a pair of frostbite shackles for insane amounts of ward retention. So we of course get all that ward retention, we get all that physical resistance. All of that combined means that our ward jumps up instantly, and it's just amazing to watch. Now, of course, like I said earlier, we cannot use spells. We also cannot use other melee attacks, mainly because not only would it consume our Fresh by the Forge stacks, which is another 80 flat damage that we don't want to lose, it would also consume our ward because Chronostasis is just generic. It works on any melee attack. So, like for instance, if I had lunge on my bar, I'd be constantly consuming my own ward and the build would suck, which means that we have only one option, one type of skill that works with this build, and that is throwing attacks. So we currently use Hammer Throw to not only apply ignites, we use it to get a large amount of increased damage from its tree. We use it to shred armor. We use it to shred physical and fire resistance. Like, Hammer Throw is our buddy in this build, and it helps a lot because it does everything that we want. Because Smelter's Wrath has a node in it that gives it more damage per ignite on the enemy. We want to be armor shredding stuff. All of that combined makes, Hammer Throw an amazing skill in this build, unironically. Like, it's actually like S tier utility skill for this build. And of course, we have access to Javelin. Javelin, it just gives us extra smites, which gives us a little bit healing, cleanse. Like, it also gives us access to a movement skill. It's not directly casting smite, so it doesn't consume our ward. So mainly, I just use Javelin as a movement skill. It's not like the best thing ever. It just applies a few ignite stacks as well, so we get a little bit more consistent ignite stacks. But overall, Javelin's like pretty meh. But like, what else are we gonna run? Shield throw? It really doesn't matter. So with all that being said, if you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that helps a lot. Also, as well, let's go in game and talk about the build in more detail, shall we? All right, so we're going to be talking about this skill rotation first. So the whole concept of the build is to channel Rebuke, get a bunch of ward, right? And then channel Smelter's Wrath. It's pretty simple. On single target, we throw out a few hammer throws, preferably 3, so we get all stacks of Zeal, and then we Smelter's Wrath and hope that we applied enough shred stacks on the target. And that's essentially how you play the build. Sometimes when you have too much damage on your monolith, sometimes you'll have to cut your Smelter's Wrath short and start channeling Rebuke early so that you can, survive, because sometimes, there are certain enemies that will hurt you very much. Like, for instance, do not grab shred, like armor shred on the monolith, otherwise you will die, because all of your defenses are dependent on armor stacking, so you don't want to die in that regard. Also, as well, poison is a very, very annoying and toxic part of the game right now. Poison does a lot of damage on enemies, so having access to a cleanse belt and having your poison res capped is great. Even through having a cognitive array sentinel with all this armor scaling, it still ends up being very like annoying. You can also get access to the armor to dot damage affix, like the experimental one, if you get it on your frostbite shackles. So that could be very good as well. That's pretty much it for the skill rotation. Let's talk about the skills themselves, shall we? So for Smelter's Wrath here, we take 2 points travel into Blacksmith's Breath. This is nice because it increases our charge speed, so we're not spending forever charging. It does not affect the Smelter's Wrath damage while charging, so like all these nodes all still work. 3 points travel into Stinging Steel, then 1 point into Volcanic Mastery. This essentially makes the build work because it always makes it so that when you're full charge, you automatically crit, which makes up for the fact that these fuckers don't have crit on them, which is great. And of course, 2 points travel to Heavy Strike. This is just more damage, of course, eventually with more plus levels. You'd want to put more plus levels in this. 1 point into Tempering Blows. This is a 150% more damage multiplier as long as we're applying ignites on our build. That's actually where a lot of our setup is about, is applying ignites. 3 points into Tempered Blows for 36% more damage. Of course, this actually applies per second, so you get up to like 72% more damage, I believe. Then 4 out of 5 points out of Whetstone. Eventually you'd want to max this because this is a lot of more damage. It works just like the Lightning Blast node, where it like multiplicative with each other, and it just gives you a very large amount of more damage. Then 3 points travel into Forge Skill. Don't really care about this. 1 point into Detonation. This makes it so into an AoE attack. This is the thing that makes Smelter's Wrath viable. Without this node, Smelter's Wrath would be terrible, so thank God it exists. 1 point travel to Brightsmith. and we don't really care about this. Then 2 out of 3 points out of Valiance. Eventually, you'd want 3 out of 3 once you have enough plus levels of Smelter's Wrath. Trust me, you'll want plus levels of Smelter's Wrath because it has a lot of more damage in it that you want to be grabbing, including this. And this just gives us a lot of more damage. Now, what does this mean? This means that we want to be inside monoliths that have a bunch of rares. We don't want to be in monoliths that have like a bunch of, what do you call them, like profane fleshes and stuff. So try not to push in like Reign of Dragons or whatever. Try to push in Black Sun where there's a bunch more rares and bosses and stuff in comparison. You don't want to be pushing in a monolith where there are no rares and bosses. Like, of course, anywhere that has profane fleshes or Imperial Watchers, you want to be pushing into like Black Sun and shit. That's like much better for this build. And that's pretty much it for Smelter's Wrath. Now for Rebuke, we take 2 points into Bide for duration. We want to be channeling Rebuke for as long as possible. 4 points into Infinite Guardian because we want even more duration. We want to be channeling Rebuke for, like I said, as long as possible. Then 2 points into Mystic Aegis. We want a little bit of cooldown. I found 6 seconds to be the appropriate amount of cooldown. You need Rebuke to be down for the build to feel wonderful. Then 2 points travel into Regenerative Shell. We don't really care about this. 3 points into Augmented Plating for the 75% increased armor while channeling. And of course, this is applied afterwards as well, thanks to Solemn Vow. So after we channel it, we get a large amount of increased armor, which is great. Then eventually, once we get a little bit more points, and we can actually dump out of this when we get more cooldown recovery speed, we can go for more points into Brave the Elements, which would give us a large amount of less damage taken from elemental damage, which is the primary damage source inside Black Sun, so that would allow you to push farther in it, having more points in this. 1 point into Protective Legacy, so the buffs persist after channeling. Then, of course, you get movement speed, which is great. Then, the buff duration. So, like, it ends up lasting like 8 seconds in total after I full channel Rebuke. So I get a very large amount of movement speed for a long time. Same thing with armor. So that actually persists into using Smelter's Wrath. So you get that increased armor and the less damage taken from elements, which would be wonderful, right? That's great. And that's pretty much it for that. Now for Hammer Throw here, mainly we want Iron Spiral. We want Catapult because we want to throw out as many hammers as possible. Then we want to grab the Armor Shred because we want to get to Armor Shred cap on bosses. Then, of course, increased damage is great from just using a utility skill. And then Ignite Chance is great because, like I said, we need Ignites for tempering blows. So Hammer Throw ends up being an all-star in terms of utility. And, of course, eventually you can put more plus levels into Ballista. Now, I actually have 1 minus mana cost ring. Eventually, you want 2 of these. You want 2 minus mana cost rings so that you can kind of just spam Hammer Throw on a boss, and that'll help our mana cost significantly on single target. And that's pretty much it for Hammer Throw. Now for Javelin here, Javelin, I'll be honest with you, it kind of doesn't really matter where you put points into. You could actually grab Perfect Setup instead to make your Smelter's Wrath cost less mana. You could do that. There's not really much you can do too much with this, but mainly all we care about is battle standard. So we throw it down on the ground, and then of course we can dash to flag so that you actually have a movement skill because, like I said, you can't use lunge, you can't use shield rush, you can't use teleport smite, you can't use anything else. So we're stuck with using, javelin banner, which is fine. Then for the last skill, same kind of thing. We're casting it from javelin standard here. All we really care about is it gives our next melee attack additional melee fire, and it also gives us attack and cast speed, which doesn't really matter. But what else are we going to grab, right? Like, we're kind of very limited on what skills we have access to. You could grab like shield throw and shield throw through stuff and get like extra armor and all that, but that's really up to you, to be honest. And that's pretty much it for the skills. Let's talk about passives that are important. So passives that are important, of course, we want the less damage taken, of course. We want to get as much strength as possible because the biggest problem with Smelter's Wrath is it's divided between physical and fire damage. So strength is our best way of scaling it properly, right? Because it gives us increased damage for both of it, right? We want that specifically. So strength stacking is very strong for this build. So grabbing strength is great. Then Void Knight here, grabbing the physical resistance. We want as much physical resistance as humanly possible with this build because the more physical resistance we have, the more ward per second we get, so we definitely want that. Then 5 points into Patient Doom. This is a very large amount of increased damage for our attacks. We're only attacking every 3 seconds anyways because of our loop, so that's great. Then 8 points into conviction for the physical and fire pen. It's very hard to get pen for two different sources of damage, like I said, since we're split. So this helps a lot. Then Forge Guard here, getting this increased physical res when hit. This will increase your ward per second. Of course, increase armor is great too. This is an amazing node, 70% increased damage and 40% increased armor. Absolutely amazing. 1 point travel to Peltis, 1 point into Shield Breaker. This allows us to shred physical res and fire res with our hammer throw. It's why our hammer throw costs so much, and it allows us to get another about 20% pen on bosses, which is great if it's all stacked up. Then 10 points into Fresh by the Forge, much like, of course, Patient Doom. We're only attacking every 3 seconds, so this is a massive 80 flat damage on top of all the other flat damage. We want to just grab as much damage as possible with a build like this, because guess what? We need damage because, we're only attacking every few seconds, so we really need to make it count when we hit, right? And eventually 8 points out of Thornmail. All that flat armor is amazing. 6 points into Crushing Blows. This gives us about 150% increased damage with our Smelter's Wrath, which is cool. That's great, right? Wonderful. Of course, mana regen's great as well, because we need a little bit of mana regen. Then we travel all the way up to Lethal Strikes for melee critical strike multiplier, because that's one thing that my current setup lacks is crit multi. We don't have crit multi on here. We don't have crit multi on here. So having crit multi through the tree is wonderful, of course. Then eventually 3 points travel to Infinite Bulwark, then 5 points eventually into Liquid Iron for the less damage taken. Of course, it also gives us Fizz Res, which is great. And that's pretty much it for the passives. If you had more passives, I would probably grab something like Doom Knight, or you could grab Might. Just grab as much strength as humanly possible, essentially, and fill out the rest of the nodes. And that's pretty much it for the passives. Now, let's talk about the blessings. So for blessings, it's a little bit more important this time. Crit multi is very important, of course, like I said. Lightning res is very important here, or you could go for ward per second since we're stacking so much retention. It would increase the amount of base ward that we're sitting at, but it's really up to you in that regard. I think a chance to gain 30 ward when hit probably would be your best in slot here. I'm pretty sure. I'm not entirely sure. You could theoretically fill out your entire idle slots with chance to gain ward when hit, since we're spending so much time standing still, but I haven't really tested it. Crit avoid, of course, so we can save some suffixes, because we want to save as many suffixes as humanly possible, because guess what? We want to be channeling our skills, and we want to be, using as much physical and cold res as possible. So we want to be saving affixes where we can. And of course, physical or cold res works in here, whatever you're missing, whatever you have less of course. Then we take armor while channeling, of course. This makes the build possible because this is a large amount of physical resistance and just resistance in general. So having that armor while channeling is amazing. That's pretty much it for the blessings. Now let's talk about the gear. For idols, like I said, you could do chance to gain ward on hit, or you can go for cold res and ward retention idols, because of course we're getting a large amount of our ward retention from Frostbite Shackles. I think the ward on hit might be the best. Now for the other idols, we grab a chance to shred armor on hit with throwing attacks. This makes it so our hammer throw applies more shred armor on the enemy, and the more shred armor we get, the better, because like I said, that's a large majority of our damage. It can be well up to 80% more damage, so we definitely want to be maxing that out. And that's pretty much it for idols as well. Now for gearing, the main things you are required to have to make this build function is an Apostate Sanctuary, double Chronostasis, they don't have to have LP on them, Frostbite Shackles, and probably a Code of the Erased Sentinel so you don't instantly die to dot damage. And that's pretty much it for the required gear. Now let's talk about the rest of it. Auguring Helm, well, of course, this would be better as a Dawn Helmet. Cold Res, Crit Avoid, Physical Res, plus levels of Smelter's Wrath. Plus levels is amazing on Smelter's Wrath. And that generic melee damage is amazing because, like I said, our damage is split, so generic melee damage is amazing. And of course, increased Smelter's Wrath damage is also great, which is great. For the chest here, strength is great because, like I said, we're armor stacking that gives percent damage to our Smelter's Wrath, percent Smelter's Wrath damage. You can go with plus levels to lunge or whatever for even more percent melee damage. Then, of course, the chest would be Biz Res and Cold Res, and then be on the Dawn chest base, but it really depends on what you have. This is your best in slot ring, other than the fact it's not on the silver ring base. If it was on the silver ring base, this would be one of the best rings ever for this build. And of course, I would have Rune of Creationed it if I had access to a Rune of Creation. And of course, this is what a generic ring looks like, of course. But if I had a Rune of Creation, I would have doubled this instantly. This is exactly what you want on your ring. This is like best in slot. Mwah, perfect. Because we want minus throwing costs, we want the fizz and like cold res, we want all of that, right? Then for the belt here, cold res, fizz res, cleanse, and then probably mana regen would be better than that fire damage, by the way, because we need a little bit of mana regen to maintain the amount of like mana that we're consuming. And of course, the other ring is meh. Frostbite shackles, eventually get the armor, dot damage reduction. You could do a lot of different stuff with frostbite shackles, cold res, fizz res, like strength, all of that combined would be amazing. Intelligence as well. The boots here, instead of that poison res, it could be fizz res, but it doesn't really matter. It could be on a better base. I just like movement speed because I like moving fast, but these could be significantly better. Of course, you could also get crit avoid here as well. Then for the relic here, eventually you'd want crit multi or like strength and like fizz and cold res eventually. But like I said, this is kind of a crapshoot because like, it's random, right? And that's pretty much it for the gearing. And that's pretty much it for the build. With all that being said, this has been Dread. I'm off to go do something else. Bye.